So you've probably heard of this term before. It's called gerrymandering. And you're thinking, that seems weird. I have no clue what that is actually about and if it really even applies to me. And surprisingly, it does, whether you realize it or not. And so today we're going to spend some time talking about gerrymandering and what it does and how it can really impact our elections here in the United States. So to understand gerrymandering, we have to go all the way back to something called the census. When the founders are creating the Constitution, they set aside a date every 10 years where the United States is going to actually count up everybody who lives in the United States. So every 10 years, the government goes from door to door and counts the citizenry. And this is called the census. And it's actually a really neat document, especially for historians, because we get to look at that document and we get to see all sorts of cool information about who lived where and why people lived there and what they were doing and those kind of things. And it's great for like genealogy to understand where your family's from. But it's also really important for politics and for government and for our government itself. And so it matters because the states know what their population is and who lives in the population. For the federal government, it's really important because they know the state population. And if you remember back to one of our earlier topics, when we talked about the Constitution itself, the Constitution is set up into three branches of government, and the legislative branch has two houses within it. It has the House of Representatives, which is made up of members from each state based on population, and then the Senate, where everybody gets two. But that House of Representatives is super important to the census because that's how we know as a state how many people live in our state. And so therefore that's how we know how many senators or how many members of the House of Representatives to give each state. And so what will happen is the census will come out and we'll get all this new information, and stat geeks kind of freak out and they get all really excited about it, really interested in it. But what it does is the government takes all that information and then they decide to do something called reapportionment. So what that means is they look and see, like, has this state lost more people or has this state gained more people? Because if you've lost people, maybe you've lost enough that you don't need that many members of the House of Representatives, whereas maybe a state that's growing really large suddenly does, right? So a state can lose seats or it can gain seats. And when it does, it must do something called redistricting, which means it has to actually draw these lines of where a congressional district is, where those members of the House of Representatives, where they're going to represent. Because in the Senate, the senators, they represent the entire state. But in the House of Representatives, they represent just a portion of your state. So somebody who is from, like, let's say Northeast Ohio is not necessarily representing the entire state of Ohio as much as they are their congressional district in Northeastern Ohio. And so redistricting is a way to adjust the electoral districts, right? And so reapportionment comes from, if you have to reapportion, then you're going to have to redistrict. States can also decide to redistrict if they want to. They don't even need to be losing or gaining seats in the House of Representatives. They can just redraw the district lines if they want to. It's one of the quirks of the Constitution that says states get certain powers. If you remember, we talked about that before, and the powers that states get are over things like elections or education, and there's lots of other ones. That's called that federal system, which we'll talk about in a minute. So if you look here, for instance, in 2010, that was the most recent census, as now we're coming upon a new census in 2020. But in 2010, the states in orange-ish kind of yellow here actually lost population, which means they actually lost members of the House of Representatives. Whereas those blue states there, they gained new people. They actually got bigger because people moved there, and they were, or they had more immigration there, right? And so as those states grew, they get a bigger share of that pie. Now, redistricting happens when a state has to reapportion, or when the senators or the state legislators of those states decide to redistrict. And so when people come and go from the district, it swells the district in different ways. And the goal, the honest, like, if we're being realistic here, and I think what the founders were trying to do is, by creating these district lines, it was to give equal representation throughout the state. That there would be enough people from all walks of life that lived into these areas that shared kind of a commonality, that then be able to have kind of this voting block together, was to give it equal proportionment, equal representation throughout the state. The problems with redistricting are exactly some of the things that are beneficial about redistricting, because see, the states run redistricting, right? And if they run the redistricting process, then unless there's unless otherwise mandated, it only happens every 10 years, right? So unless the state decides we just want to change our districts because maybe they're unfair, it only happens every 10 years. So if a state draws their district lines for the next 10 years, that's where you're at. That's your district, right? Also, the party in power, usually the state legislatures or the governors, actually have the right to redraw the lines however they want. This is not an illegal thing. There is no formal way of which that you're supposed to do this. There's no law that says this is how you redistrict, right? You're supposed to make it proportional. You're supposed to do some certain things, right? But there's nothing that sits you down and says, okay, but you have to make this a fair process, right? Like Democrats and Republicans both have to be equally represented within these districts. Or when you draw the districts, you have to make sure that everybody has a fair chance. And so sometimes what we call partisans, right, people who kind of are only backing their party, sometimes partisans will redraw the lines in a way that helps themselves and helps their party and helps kind of grow that party and make them more powerful, right? That is called gerrymandering. So when you hear the term gerrymandering and you start thinking, what the heck is this term gerrymandering? That's actually what it is. Gerrymandering is just that. It is the reapportioning, the redistricting of congressional districts to favor one party over another. Again, in 2010, the state of Ohio, for instance, they lost 2 members of the House of Representatives. They went down to 16, right? They had a negative of 2 because they had lost population. And so they had to reapportion. They were reapportioned, and therefore they had to redistrict their congressional lines, all right? Now, I'm going to use Ohio, because I'm teaching from Ohio, and so my students, are going to be the most familiar with the places I'm talking about in Ohio. But this is not a thing that just happens in only Ohio. But Ohio was pretty heavily gerrymandered in 2010, right? And so just to give us some context about what gerrymandering really is and where it comes from, because it's an interesting term, gerrymandering is the process by which you draw these favorable district lines to help one party or another, right? And so you create these electoral districts that manipulate the boundaries of the district. So maybe you'll cut a county in half, for instance, right? Or maybe you'll cut an urban area, like a city, into different pieces, right? You can do 2 types, which we're going to talk about in a minute. There's 2 main types of gerrymandering. One is called packing. And packing is when you pack as many people of the same ideology into one area so that it kind of neutralizes their vote. Or there's something else called cracking. And they're kind of nice. They kind of rhyme back and forth, right? Packing and cracking. But cracking actually does the exact opposite. It takes that group of people, right? Let's say that this group of people, and it breaks them up into a whole bunch of different districts so they have less of a voice, right? The term actually, though, has some historical merit to it. It comes from 1812. The Boston papers at the time accused Elbridge Gerry of rigging, kind of redrawing the lines to help favor his party, the Democratic Republican Party. And so it became known as gerrymandering because he was the governor of the time and his name was Elbridge Gerry. Get it? And if you look up there actually in the top left, that's a political cartoon of his first kind of gerrymandered districts that he wrote. So how might you divide these voters up? Well, there's a lot of different ways. And whether you pack or whether you crack, that depends on how you want the votes to plan out. And that's going to depend on where people are. But you might choose to pack or to crack based on a number of factors. One of them could be on voter preference. Let's say you live in a very conservative state, right? But you've got a few urban centers that are very liberal, right? If you're conservative, you might want to break those liberal districts up so that way a city, for instance, is split up into 6 different districts. And so while there's a lot of people that live in the city and their vote might outweigh a lot of other places, since they're into 6 different districts, it makes it a lot harder for them. You might do it by race. Maybe it's an urban population or a rural population, and you want to neutralize a white vote or a black vote or a Latino vote, etc. You might do it by education. Oftentimes, like college towns, for instance, tend to be pretty liberal places. You might want to break them up. Or maybe you want to break up rural areas that maybe don't have as much education and lump them into more urban areas to kind of neutralize their vote. But whatever you're trying to do, you're trying to erode away the vote. And I challenge you for a second to take a second here and actually pause the video and look at the chart on the right. All right. What this chart shows you is on the top, the faint lines there are the share of the population of each state. So for instance, if you look at, let's say Ohio, for instance, right? It's about 51% of the population voted for Republicans in the 2010 election, right? 51%. Now, Ohio has, I believe it's 14 congressional, or 14 votes, right? Or 16 votes, right? So in theory, they should get 9 and the Democrats should get 7, right? But instead, what happens is it becomes much, much more lopsided through something like gerrymandering, where you can split these people up. And so as you see here, the Democrats actually have a lower proportion of House members versus how many people actually live in the state who voted for Democrats overall. Right? And I'm using this as an example, 2010 as an example, because 2010 was a pretty heavily gerrymandered year, where Republicans really kind of took charge in the 2010 midterm elections and did this. But Democrats are guilty of this too. There's allegations of it in Pennsylvania and in California and some other states, and throughout history it has gone back and forth, both sides. The most recent is Republican gerrymandering, but that doesn't mean that Democrats are not guilty of this as well. So I just want to make sure we preface that before we go any further. So let's look really quickly, and I'm going to give you a nice visual chart here. We found this on the internet a few weeks ago, and this does a really great job of kind of giving you an example of how you can gerrymander. All right, so on the left over here, we have 50 people. All right, let's say 50 people live in your district. 60 of them are for the blue team, and 40% of them are for the red team. Right now, in perfect representation, you would divide them up where they're kind of all in their own districts, right? And so then, as a result, the blue districts would have 3 House members, right? Or there'd be 3 blue districts, sorry, and then there would be 2 red districts, right? That's in a proportional, perfect representation of the people who live in your area, right? But let's say you want the blue team to win. And so what you're going to do is you're going to pack a district, right? So you're going to kind of compact people into one place, right? So let's say maybe you're packing people in, and so on the third one here, right, the blue team wins because there's people packed in, but they don't really have any kind of vote or say, right? And then the third one on the right is packing and cracking. We're going to look at both of these here in just a second, but I want to give you kind of let you see this first. So we've talked about cracking, but let's look at an actual representation of it. So in that second column, right, the compact but fair, that's the example of cracking, where we've broken people up into different districts, into 5 different districts. The red team, for instance, right? And so the blue team is always going to have more people because of the way it's distributed, and the red team's always going to have less people. And so that means the red team's never really going to win an election, and the districts are always going to vote towards the blue team, right? You can also see cracking over in the third column, right? And so you can see here, the blue team this time has been cracked, right? They have a big proportion, right? But they've split up these votes all over the place. This is something you would see maybe in an urban area, where if you really wanted a place that is traditionally like Democratic, for instance, right? If you want to break up a Democratic district, you might break them up like this, right? And so you see on the top here, you have 4 people in one, and then there's 2 or 3 in the other, and then they're kind of all spread out, right? So that's cracking. But then you might kind of make a new district around them that's packed, that's just almost all blue, other than maybe 1 or 2 people, right? And so all those people are packed in there. The thing about cracking is, the important thing, district lines are drawn, and the minority population is broken up into different districts. They are cracked like a window, right? It's broken up into many different pieces, right? It spreads out the vote. Packing, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. It piles as many people as you can into one district. So let's say, for instance, you have a state that has a few rural or a few urban centers where that is the majority of your population, and the majority of your population is liberal, for instance, right? And so if you want to break up that liberal vote and allow the rural districts to have more say and kind of more influence, then you would maybe pack and have a few blue districts, right, overall. But for the most part, you're not going to give, like, let's say a whole urban area, a 50-mile radius around it into the same district. You might split up into a very small district with really high concentrated groups of blue voters, right? So in this case, that's what they did. And in this case, you can see here, actually, the red team wins, not the blue team, because they end up getting 3 districts versus 2, even though they're at almost a 2-to-1 difference in the actual vote. So packing creates minority members concentrates them into one district area. It packs them all in. Why is this? Why would you want to do this? Because it creates a supermajority. Effectively, if 70% of those people show up to vote, they're still voting for one person, and that one person is going to get elected. But if they had been in multiple districts, for instance, and all of those people had shown up, maybe they have a better chance at having 2 or 3 or 4 people who vote the same way in the same district. So why is this important? Well, let's look at the impact of Ohio itself, the state that I teach in, right? So you can see here, and this might be a little difficult to tell, and you can find this online if you want to, but this is from the Cleveland Plain Dealer out of Cleveland, Ohio, and what it does is it shows the redistricting efforts going back to 1982. So in 1982, there was a census, right? And they redrew the lines, right? And you can kind of make out, but you can see the numbers where the districts go. And the idea, it looks like, was trying to kind of coalesce people into similar districts, right? Keeping a member of the House of Representatives in a district that they live in, right? 92, there was another census, and from there it went till 2002. And you see the districts are kind of broken up this time. They're a lot bigger than they used to be, right? Then you start going to 2002 to 2012. And now with the advent of color, you can start to see kind of the real differences in them. So you get districts, for instance, like District 5 up in the left corner, that goes all the way from the Toledo area, all the way across to, really, realistically, only about an hour outside of Cleveland, Ohio. You get something like District 6, that encompasses, parts of Athens County and Hocking County, and all the way up through, up to almost Youngstown area. Then you get to 2012, and you can see the same thing has happened again. And take a moment and notice what happens to large areas, what we call in Ohio the 3 C's: Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus, right? They start to be broken up really quickly. And so what happens is, for instance, like in the Columbus area, if you notice, the very, very tiny kind of yellowish tan color district that makes up the greater city of Columbus, right? That is its own district. But then all the surrounding suburbs around it are another district. And one of the ways that this area was gerrymandered was because then when you look even in the far left corner at someplace like Athens County is, again, split into half. And the reason why Athens County is important is because Ohio University is there, and so therefore, there's this kind of, again, a university town. It might there's Southeast Ohio has a small population. The biggest center of life there is going to be around the university, and so if it was in its own district, right, it might influence the district and influence Southeast Ohio, and so you very well could have, let's say, for instance, since it's a fairly liberal place, like you could have a Democratic member of the House of Representatives. But if you cut it in half and you merge it with the suburbs around Columbus, there's a much lower risk of it moving to blue, whereas its voter block, while all packed in the same area, now has to contend with all of the larger suburban areas around Columbus. And so it makes it much, much harder for Athens to be able to swing an election one way or the other. Here's kind of a more detailed map of it, and you can see, again, bottom left corner, Athens County is kind of cut off right there. You can see some of the areas. Hamilton County, for instance, the Cincinnati area is split up into 2, right? There's kind of the yellowish District 1, and then District 2 kind of takes over most of the bottom southeast or southwest corner of Ohio. Now, actually, the Cleveland.com did kind of an ungerrymandered map. So like, what would a district, what would the map look like if it was not gerrymandered? If you just grouped people together by where they live and populations, and you tried to have like an equal distribution of population, and you can see it's a much, much, much more simplified map. And it's also having districts where the member of the House of Representative has a much higher likelihood of actually living in the district that they represent. I mean, if you think about it, if you look at the map on the left, for instance, it's possible in the blue, Carroll County, which is all the way up almost towards the top, right? Somebody could live in Carroll or Columbiana County, right? But actually represent all the way down in Lawrence County next to Kentucky. Right? It's virtually impossible for somebody to really represent that district and know every square mile of that district. And years ago, when the maps were far more simpler, it was easy for a member of the House of Representatives to move from district to district to district, to be able to, or move from county to county to county, to be able to meet their constituents and know what the voting populace wants. In today's districts, it's much, much more difficult to be able to do that. And so then you start getting people who don't know their representatives as well as they used to in years past. As I said, Ohio's not the only place that did this. Texas is a good example. The map on the left, District 35, or the 35 right there, that is actually Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas is what people often refer to as a blue pearl and a sea of red, right? Texas is traditionally a pretty conservative state. Austin and Houston have much more liberal centers, right? And so Austin, a way to break up that block and keep Austin from having enough votes or being able to voice their opinion to have it be a Democratic member of the House of Representatives, well, we'll break them up into different districts. And so if you can count here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different districts that make up the city of Austin, just the city itself, not even every the surrounding area. So you can see now they're tied into where maybe there's only 5,000 people that live in that district within the city limits, but there's another 10,000 that live outside of that district or outside of the city limits, and those people might be far more conservative than the 5,000 that live inside the district. That's a good example of cracking, right? The map on the right from Houston area is another example of that, right? There's some areas that are going to be packed in, but for the most part, Houston is pretty cracked. It's pretty split up. Let's get one final example, because I think this is important for you to see that it is not just in one state. This does happen throughout the nation. So North Carolina actually has a Supreme Court case about it going through the Supreme Court, and it will work its way through, and they'll make a decision before too long, right? But North Carolina actually has a case about racial gerrymandering that's happening, and so the state Democratic Party is actually challenging whether or not the Republicans in the state drew the district lines based on race. And so what you can notice here is, for instance, if you look on the bottom right, the percentage of population by congressional district that is white or black alone, non-Hispanic, right? You can see that the map on the right that says black alone pretty much mirrors the blue, the area held by Democrats, the districts 1 and district 12 and district 4 that are held on the top map, right? Whereas on to the left, the white alone, right, very much mimics and looks almost like the inverse, almost like a photo negative of the map on the top. The interesting thing too is if you look at the pie charts on the left, the statewide North Carolina House of Representatives vote, just the amount of people who voted in 2012, 50.5% of people voted for the Democratic Party, 48.7% voted for the Republican Party. If you're looking at that map alone, you would say, oh, it is a fairly Democratic-leaning state, right? It's got a fair amount of people who are leaning to the left, right? Who are leaning more liberal, right? But if you looked at their proportion of members of the House of Representatives, at the end of that election, the Democrats got 4, and the Republicans got 9, even though more people voted for Team Blue than Team Red. So you have to look at these things, and when we think about why are these states, we sometimes call them red states or blue states. Sometimes it's not about whether or not they're even a red state or blue state. Sometimes it just depends on how their district lines are drawn. That actually might play more into it. And so, question time, right? This is the part of it where we kind of ask, why is this so important? What about this makes this such an important thing? Well, first of all, how do we fix this? That's kind of the most important question, and there's a number of different ways. One, it's through bipartisan commissions. An example is Ohio actually passed a constitutional amendment that is supposed to create a bipartisan commission where Republicans and Democrats or liberals and conservatives actually sit down and they draw the lines out to be as fair as possible. And that's working its way slowly through Ohio. It hasn't changed yet. There's some hope that the next census will actually bring about some change. 2, constitutional amendment. There is the issue of federalism that we've talked about already, and that federalism, the way the states are organized, states get to run the elections. But if you have a federal constitutional amendment against gerrymandering, making it illegal, then it would force states to have to draw proportional districts correctly. Or the Supreme Court could be the third one. There are a number of cases that are working their way through, and there will be continued challenges from here going forward about what can happen. But the easiest way, the simplest way, realistically, to change this is to simply vote. See, what happens often is midterm elections, those ones that when the president is not up for re-election, the ones that sometimes don't end in a zero, right? Those elections don't draw as many people to vote. Typically, the people who vote in those elections are political watchers, people who really like politics, like myself, right? I go vote in every election that I can because I really enjoy it, right? Older populations, wider populations, more educated populations, they often tend to vote in those elections. It's not the general mass group, right? And so, for instance, like if we look back to our discussion on the Electoral College, right, we can think about the Electoral College, right? You have to win the Electoral College to be president, right? But popular vote shows you how many people actually voted. And in the 2016 election, as has happened in other elections, right, Donald Trump actually didn't win the popular vote. More people in the country voted for Hillary Clinton than voted for Donald Trump, but he still won, right? And so this same thing can still happen. Your state could be fairly conservative or fairly liberal, but if enough of those liberal or conservative voters don't show up to the polls, then a kind of minority section of your state, of your population, could actually decide everything for you. And so in 2010, when it was a census year, there was a wave of Republicans that swept into Congress. They took over many governorships. They took over many House state legislatures because people didn't vote, or not as many people voted as, say, in 2008 when voter turnout was at really, really high, or in 2014 when it was really high again, right? Or sorry, 2012 when it was really high again, right? Because people like to show up for presidential elections. But those local elections, those state elections, are actually probably more important than anything else, right? Those are the ones where really the dirty work gets done and the hard things get passed, right? Because states run elections and states can decide how their elections are run. Can you register and vote on the same day? Do you have to register before? Do you need 2 forms of ID? Do you need a voter registration card, right? How are my district lines going to be drawn up? States have that right through federalism, right? It's that check that they have on the government's power. And so they have a huge impact on all of this. So that's how we fix this. And if you want to fix it, and I encourage you to, I hope you do, then reach out to your member of Congress and say, gerrymandering just feels wrong, right? It feels like you're rigging the game in favor of one group over another. And while my team might not win all the time, I might not win every election, that's okay, because I also want it fair. Because, see, the thing is that we have a constitutional right to a vote, right? That's your voice. That's you expressing your free expression of yourself. And to be in a gerrymandered district or in a gerrymandered state, whether it be for liberals or conservatives or Democrats or Republicans, whoever does it, it takes away that constitutional right. It takes away that vote from you. And so it's important that things like gerrymandering are put to rest once and for all. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that this taught you something that's really important, and I hope you hold on to this, because as you become, whether you're an adult listening to it now or whether you're one of my students and you're listening to this, it's important to know where this comes from and how we change this process, and to pay attention and to remember, as I always say, elections matter. Until next time.